Paiute Valley, Nevada, summer of 2012. I was working nights at the maintenance lot behind the old High Sierra Motel, painting a storage trailer under a halogen lamp while most of the valley slept. It was the kind of routine that numbed you into believing nothing unusual could ever happen in the middle of a desert night. Then, around 2 in the morning, something that did not belong to that routine arrived in the sky and changed the way I remember everything that came before it. A cluster of lights appeared out of nowhere, a clean, hard white that made the stars look like dust, and the ground around me hummed the way an old transformer hums, only louder and sharper, as if the air itself had been tuned to a frequency that hurt my teeth. I felt a pressure in my chest, like someone had pressed their palm against my sternum, and the world tilted for a breath. I tried to stand, and my legs wanted to fold. I was pulled half off the ladder, my fingers stinging as if frozen, and the next thing I remember is waking up on my back in the sagebrush with gravel in my mouth. For hours I had no memory of what happened in between, and that blankness kept folding into my dreams that same night, a replay that revealed something stranger than the sight itself. I will tell you everything I remember, who else was there, what the doctors wrote down, and what it did to my life. I grew up in a town the size of a postcard, a place where everyone learned early how to read the sky for storms and for planes. My father taught me how to change a tire before he taught me how to change a spark plug. My mother stayed up late to mend uniforms for the local volunteer fire crew so she could save the extra money. We moved to the valley when I was 12, and I watched my first meteor shower beside a coal-black sky that felt like a blanket. That sense of the world being both wide and intimate stuck with me. I learned to trust what my eyes and hands told me more than what anyone else said, and that made the night I saw those lights harder to swallow, because my eyes and hands contradicted what the record books expected. I had been a mechanic for 10 years by then, a reliable number on the town payroll, the kind of person people called when a generator failed at 2 in the morning. My reputation was part of my identity. I had never been the sort to tell a story for attention or to chase a headline. I believed in tools and receipts and witnesses. By the time I was 25, I had married once and ended up single again. I had a daughter named Ellie who lived with her mother across town and came to the fair. Motel pools in the summer to cannonball like a small comet. I kept a dog named Rufus, a lanky mutt that smelled like sunscreen and leather, and I still had my father in small ways, in the way I tied knots and in the way I folded tarp for winter. Those small inherences felt like proof I was grounded. That is important because when your feet stop feeling solid after an event, you have to have some small place to hang on. These 3 paragraphs are not an attempt to ask for pity. They are the map I used to find my way back when the map changed. The first experience played out as a slow and then sudden sequence like a camera reel shuttering into a new frame. I remember setting down the brush, the way the paint smelled of mineral spirits and hot metal. The halogen lamp threw a yellow circle big enough for me to work in, and beyond it the desert was a black bowl. Rufus was asleep inside the trailer with his head on my toolbox. The sound of his breathing was the only steady thing. Then came a noise like a distant radio being cranked up and tuned through many stations at once, every frequency layering on top until it resolved into a single tone that vibrated my fillings. The lights descended, not as a single object at first, but as a spread, 6 precise points arranged like a constellation I did not know. They moved in a way that was too deliberate to be a helicopter and too silent to be anything with wings. I stood up because instinct to run was immediate, and the first real physical response was a burning pressure around my knees, as if someone had wrapped a hot band of metal around them. My breaths got shallow and sharp. The desert air tasted like iron and lemon peel. Then something touched the back of my neck, not with fingers but with a cool electric sensation that made the hairs on my forearms stand up. I called out without thinking. "Hello," I said, voice small. "Hey, is everything okay?" A voice answered from the motel office window, muffled by glass and distance. It was Elena, the night clerk. "I think I saw lights," I said, trying to keep my hands from trembling. "Lights like a drone?" she asked, voice thin with the same small disbelief people use on nights that do not yet belong to stories. "No, not like a drone," I said, which was already a sentence that mattered more than I thought. "Do you want me to call the sheriff?" she asked, the practical question that seemed to anchor both of us. "Please," I said, and then I realized I could not move my feet. "My legs," I said, and that was the last coherent thought before the noise drilled into my skull and everything went fuzzy. Elena shouted for Rufus, and I heard her footsteps. By the time she was at my side, the lights were gone, as if someone had excised them from the sky with a cut of knife. We spoke 6 exchanges in total that night, and every one of them is as clear to me as a photograph, which later helped when Elena agreed to speak to the sheriff. That dialogue became a small piece of corroboration that kept me from being written off as a man having a breakdown. I will pause here to say something directly to you, because if you are sitting with a cold twitch of apprehension, you are not alone. If you are feeling the same shiver I felt in my voice as I retell this, you are part of a community that counts. Do you have a momentary story like this, where the ordinary was ripped for a second and left you with questions? If so, please comment below, starting with the city you saw something in and a phrase like, "I saw lights in," so we can build a simple map. Your contribution matters, because patterns form only when we share the dots. Each short reply helps me and others draw lines between isolated nights and maybe find a thread that explains more. Tell your one sentence, keep it to the city and what you saw, and know that every sincere account adds to a quieter body of evidence we do not get from files alone. Now I will go back to my story and show how that single night branched into others who saw similar things. The immediate after effects were not just physical. I had a headache that felt like a fist wrapped around my temple and a metallic taste that would not leave for 2 days. I found small, circular reddened patches on my forearms and a shallow, scorched mark on the back of my neck the size of a coin. Dr. Ruiz at the Paiute Community Clinic marked them down as superficial burns with an odd thermal pattern and wrote in my chart that they did not match sunscreen burns or typical contact dermatitis. Sheriff Cole came by the next afternoon and took a statement. He was polite and his pencil made a dry sound on paper, but I could hear the way he withheld belief. I spoke with Sheriff Cole, with Elena the clerk, with a trucker named Mark who had been sleeping in his rig across the lot and who saw the lights too, and with a guest named Sarah who swore she watched them hang above the highway like a suspended string of lanterns. I slept badly for nights after. The replay dream returned with precise edits, a close-up of a steel surface I could not fully see, and a voice that sounded like a translation in my bones. The dreams left me shaken, but also with fragments, images that came back in pieces, a symbol etched on metal, a taste like copper and mint, a bucolic sense of being watched with a clinical calm. Those images forced me to question whether the blankness that cut my memory had been filled with something I had been taught to ignore. Moment of tension 1 came quickly and lasted long in my memory. I was back at the lot at dawn to collect my tools, and the sky was still threaded with cold blue. I felt someone watching me and turned to find Tom the line cook from the diner holding a thermos, eyes suspicious and pointed. He asked what had happened, and I told him as much as I could. As I spoke, a low freight train sound arrived from nowhere, and my breathing shortened. The air took on the taste of gasoline and ozone, and Rufus tucked his tail and tried to hide under the trailer. Tom tried to laugh, but his voice cracked, and that split between the laugh and the crack is what made me believe we were not imagining the same thing. For 2 minutes we stared, and then the sound stopped. The moment was small in seconds, but stretched long in the way that trauma does. The second moment of tension happened 3 nights later when a set of headlights crossed the highway and stopped as if waiting for permission. Ben, who works at the gas station, came running out barefoot and with a flashlight, his face gleaming with sweat and fear. He asked if I was okay, and I could only answer with the image that kept replaying in my head, of light slicing the desert into plains, and of a metallic gleam that reflected the moon. A smell like old pennies rose from the open road, and I felt a pressure in my ears like being deep underwater. Ben pressed his hand against my shoulder and said we should go to the clinic. In the waiting room, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and I felt smaller and more exposed than I had in years. The third moment of tension came during an interview with a local reporter named Anna, who had more curiosity than caution. Her questions were near gentle but persistent. I told her about the dream and the mark on my neck and how I kept waking up with rope burn on my palms, though no rope had been used. She leaned forward and asked if I wanted to record the dreams. As I described one of the images, I felt the room cool, and a sound like wind in the power lines arrived. She shivered and her recorder clicked. For 3 paragraphs we told the story to each other, and the air in that hotel room felt sharp as glass. I am not the only person in this valley to have a story like this. A month after my incident, I met with a woman named Lisa who runs a bed and breakfast 6 roads over. She had a story that started with a smell, citrus and rust, and a night where the owls went silent. On a Tuesday in late spring of 2011, she woke to see a ring of light over her garden and a small figure moving in perfect steps among the rose bushes. The figure had no shadow, and it tilted its head like a child listening. Lisa called her neighbor Paul, and he came out in slippers and confirmed the light and a humming like bees trapped in glass. Paul is a retired electrician who keeps meticulous notes about the town, and who later brought photographs that showed an odd bloom of light in one frame and nothing in the frames before and after. They told me the way someone tells you about an accident they survived, with a mix of disbelief and distance. Their testimony mattered because Paul sent his photographs to the county paper, and Anna wrote a short column that mentioned the High Sierra Motel. After that, the sheriff logged a handful of calls from people who said they had seen the same pattern of lights over the highway and fields. A second parallel case came from a man named Hector who runs towing for the county. He described a night on Route 6 where he pulled over to help a truck with a blown tire, and when he got out, 6 lights made a geometry above him that hummed like a swarm. He smelled solder and old pennies and felt a thin film of warmth at the back of his neck. Hector brought me a physical trace, a scrap of metal he said fell from the air and lodged in the dirt beside his tow truck. It was small and oddly textured, with grooves that did not look machined by anything in our shop. He let Dr. Ruiz take a sample, and the clinic logged it as evidence. Hector, Mark, Lisa, Paul, and Elena later gave statements, and the sheriff placed a brief note in the reports file under Unexplained Luminescence. Naming them here matters because when multiple independent witnesses describe consistent sensory details, the story becomes harder to dismiss as a single error. After the initial weeks, the strange symptoms did not vanish. I had trouble concentrating at work, and I found myself checking the sky for no reason at odd hours. I started keeping a notebook on my nightstand, and in it I wrote the dreams, each entry starting with the same line, because ritual felt safer than chaos. I read everything I could find that seemed relevant, from UFO reports to neurology papers on transient blackout episodes with post-event dreams. I spoke to Dr. Ruiz about the burns, and to a neurologist in Carson City named Dr. Patel, who ordered a basic panel and an EEG. The tests came back inconclusive in the sense that there was no obvious seizure activity, but there was a faint irregularity that Dr. Patel called nonspecific slowing, which in his notes suggested a disturbance that could be metabolic, infectious, or unknown. He was careful on the phone, the kind of careful that means you are being taken seriously, but there is no tidy answer. I started to want community more than answers. I joined a small online forum for people who woke with marks and shared dreams. I started recording my dreams on my phone and sending them to Anna when she asked. The way I rearranged my life was both mundane and radical. I locked my truck differently at night. I stopped working overnight shifts. I sent Ellie a postcard that simply said, "Think of the ocean when you are afraid," and I kept her photograph on my workbench. Interpreting all this has been the slow work of balancing what is felt with what can be shown. I am not a person who wants to insist on one label. The word UFO can trigger images of sensationalism and late-night talk shows. The phrase alien encounter does the same. I consider 3 lanes of possibility, and I walk each of them without committing to one as the only truth. One lane is physical anomaly, something in our atmosphere or a craft of unknown origin that interacts with the human nervous system in ways we do not yet measure. This possibility is why Dr. Patel ordered tests and why Sheriff Cole logged our reports. The second lane is psychological and neurological, where an environmental trigger causes a perceptual event that is experienced as external. The third lane is social and symbolic, where a community constructs meaning around shared anomalies, and those meanings change behavior in ways that are measurable. All 3 lanes have examples in the record, and all 3 seem inadequate alone. What I know is that my life changed. I stopped assuming the night was neutral. I became more grateful in certain small ways, like the way I now notice Ellie when she walks into a room, and the way Rufus sleeps with one eye open. There were moral and emotional dilemmas that followed. One was whether to accept compensation offered informally by a researcher passing through who wanted to study our sleep patterns. I worried that a monetary exchange would make our stories commodities and that our scars would be rewritten into data. Another dilemma was how to tell Ellie in a way that did not make the world bigger than she needed it to be. I decided to be honest in a scaled way. I told her I had seen lights and that sometimes the world gets strange, but that people who love you keep you safe. That small moral choice felt more consequential than anything the investigators did. I also had to decide whether to publicly push for an official investigation. Sheriff Cole listened and filed reports, but his hands were tied by budget and jurisdiction, and by the way agencies prefer incidents with physical evidence that can be easily cataloged. The scrap Hector found helped, the photographs Paul brought helped, but a deeper question of intention or design remains beyond our paperwork. 1 month later, there was a small but measurable change. The initial marks on my skin faded into pale circles, and the dream replays lost some of their clarity. The local paper ran a column that put our town on a short list of places with multiple witness reports. A researcher from the state university named Dr. Hammond called to ask if he could interview us for a small study, and he promised to keep the process clinical. I met with him at the library, and we spoke for 2 hours. He had a calm voice and steady hands, and he showed me a form that looked like a lab request. He asked about timing, about food, about medication, about the weather. His questions were technical and oddly comforting. We joined a small cohort of 10 people who agreed to nightly sleep logs and baseline blood work. That month, I noticed more cars on the highway at night, more people pulling over to look up, and a sense in the town of being watched that was equal parts curiosity and apprehension. The sheriff updated the file with the additional witness statements, and the county paper mentioned the project Dr. Hammond was starting. The community reaction made the town different, the way a bruise makes skin read differently to the eye. 3 months later, the pattern had shifted in a way that felt more organized than I liked. People were matching details across reports. Paul brought additional photographs, and an amateur astronomer in Ellie analyzed them and noted anomalies in the exposure that did not match any common camera artifact. Dr. Hammond reported preliminary results that suggested a repeatable sensory cluster among the witnesses involving a metallic taste, localized pressure, and transient skin marks. He was careful with his language and used phrases like preliminary and correlation. The online forum we had joined grew into a small regional group with members from neighboring counties. And Anna, the reporter, ran a follow-up that included interviews with Mark, Ben, Lisa, Paul, and Hector. Ellie came to a public hearing at the community center with her mother and sat in the second row listening while adults debated whether to call in federal agencies or to keep data local. Between the municipal meeting and the way the community organized itself, I felt both empowered and exposed. We were no longer just people who had strange nights. We were a group with shared details that could not be dismissed with a shrug. 6 months after the initial sighting, the tangible results were modest but meaningful. Dr. Patel reviewed my EEG and suggested a longer-term monitoring plan, which I agreed to. Dr. Hammond published a short brief that did not claim an answer, but did document a cluster of similar sensory reports across independent witnesses. The sheriff forwarded the file to a state agriculture inspector who had once handled livestock reports of unknown causes. And the investigator came with a small team and their own equipment. They did not find conclusive evidence of a craft, but they did catalog soil samples from the lot and the roadside that showed traces of an alloy not commonly found in the region. The material analysis returned a note of uncertainty, described terms like trace element and non-standard alloy pattern. It raised more questions. My life changed in smaller ways as well. I stopped working most nights, I changed the way I kept time, and I started a small group that met every Thursday in the VFW hall to share observations and help each other with sleep and stress. The group included Elena, Mark, Sarah, Tom, and Paul. Naming them here again matters because each person kept a version of the night alive in a way that made official records feel less cold. After 6 months, I still did not have an answer, but I had neighbors who listened. If you have read this far and you carry a fragment of the same experience, please leave a short comment below. Tell us the city you saw something in and one short line about what you saw, starting with, "I saw lights in." Your words will help build a map that is more than rumor. If this story touched you and you want to hear more real accounts from real people who prefer truth over certainty, please subscribe. Here we share testimonies, look at evidence with care, and treat every experience with the respect it deserves. Some things may never be fully explained, but each story brings us a little closer to understanding. If you have a camera or a note from that night, keep it safe, and if you are in pain, seek medical attention and ask for documentation. Thank you for listening and for being part of a community that does not turn away from the strange.